I have a bonus question for you.
Okay, fantastic.
And feel free to not stick to the time limit. Not that we have been imposing it strictly, but I think this answer does deserve more time.
Okay.
How would you create a similar summary or a gist between the three classical music eras? So Baroque, classical, and Romantic.
Well, if I can add a sort of a fourth era, everything after Romantic. Well, I think to work backwards, I think in the modern era, we'll call it now, because usually the Romantic era, like the historians would say that the Romantic era ended, I don't know, anywhere between 1880 and 1930. And, because there's some of the Russian composers we were talking about, like Rachmaninoff, they're writing music that's very much a Romantic music in the 19-teens and 20s. Debussy was writing things that were not really romantic anymore, like impressionistic, and that's sort of on the pathway to this modern era. But I think today, there's so many different types of music that are accepted. So as a composer, you can write almost anything you want, but then the music will also carry with it some signal about how it should be listened to. In other words, I could write a piece that sounds very romantic. It uses the musical language from the Romantic era, and it sort of signals to the audience, like, that's my intention, like, that's the framework that I'm in. But I could also write something, and there were American composers like these so-called minimalist composers, like Philip Glass or something like that. And they're more of it has more in common maybe with an Indian raga. Not saying that it is one, but it has in common with it. It's more about repetitive gestures, like lulling you into this meditative thing. And you can write music like that now, and then people know, it's like influenced by that.
That's the more modern style.
Yeah.
What would be the Baroque and the classical style?
So I think I think that's the modern era, many styles. So then for Baroque style, I mean, the way I think of it is like, the way I try to think about it, how do you say? I mean, Baroque style is known for its ornamentation, right? Mm-hmm. So the piece of paper, the music will have like some musical phrases on it, and then you, the performer, are supposed to go back. Maybe you play it once without ornaments, and then you add it in, and you add all this filigree and extra stuff. Sometimes the ornaments are marked on the score. Sometimes you can make up your own and you figure it out. There's a certain way to do that as well. That's one aspect of Baroque.
By definition, it's Baroque, right? With all the ornamentation, like the furniture, the architecture.
Absolutely. And I also think, like, if you look at Bach's piano music, for example, it tends to stay in one mood. In that sense, it's kind of close to an Indian raga. Like, it's not necessarily a narrative that weaves in and out of many, many different moods within the same movement or within the same piece of music. Of course, from movement to movement or from piece of music to piece of music, it would change dramatically. Sure. And there is some variation, obviously. But if you look at his preludes and fugues, the well-tempered clavier, the piano, sort of this 48 preludes and fugues, each prelude kind of has its own, it has its own mood, and it doesn't really stray from that. It's kind of strictly in that. The same thing with the fugues. For classical music, I think it's structure, order. There's still a sense of personal expression, but the emphasis is more on the structure and the order of the music. 4 measure phrases. Yeah. Clearly defined, stops, ends. You do have changes in mood, but it would be abrupt. It would be, we're going to finish this in like a joyful fashion. Stop. Okay. New section, new accompaniment figure, new mood. Mm-hmm. So very sectionalized in that sense. I'm not sure that the listener experiences that way, but that is how the music is organized. Whereas Romantic era, you still have structure, but the personal emotion part is kind of like more at a higher priority level in the style. So you'll have movement between moods very fluidly. You could change moves, you could change the mood of the music in the middle of a phrase. It wouldn't be necessarily a sharply defined change from section to section. It can be. So it's more free in that sense, but it's still very structured like classical music is. And then I referenced this idea about tonal music, this music that has a real sense of sort of home in it. I think towards the end of the Romantic era, one of the things in Romantic music that they started playing with, because classical music is very tonal also. So you have this sort of home, the concept of keys in music, like, oh, it's in this key or it's in the key of C major or D major. You can think of it kind of like your neighborhood, like this piece of music occurs in your neighborhood. And in classical music, you might explore, to use that metaphor, your neighborhood plus the neighborhood next door but then you come back to your neighborhood. So you don't go too far from home. And if you do, it'll just be for a quick second. Whereas in romantic music, you still define the home neighborhood, but as the romantic era goes on, the music spends more and more time not in your home neighborhood. So you may acknowledge in the piece of music, I'm living in this neighborhood, this key, but most of the piece is actually going to occur in this other key, which is a really far away neighborhood. And we still live there, but most of our time is spent here. And it's kind of that idea, like, how much time do you spend rooted in the home place? And then how much time do you spend in transition? And usually transition by definition is like, well, we're in this, like the home key, we have a short transition and now we're in this other key. But what happens if the transition becomes longer than sort of the primary melodies? And those are kind of the dynamics that led to like the dissolution of tonality, because what happens when the whole piece takes place there and we don't even kind of mention where we live anymore? We don't have that, and that's gone. And
what
now,
is new home?
Yeah. And sometimes it can have, Mahler is a composer that did that quite a lot. Still a tonal composer, but endless amounts of time spent away from Wagner is also a composer famous for that. His opera called Tristan and Isolde, the opening overture, is famous for being, one of the key moments where, the gestures, the musical melodies seems like it should be romantic music. But if you look at it, if you analyze it, if you just listen to it, who knows where home is? No clue. And that is kind of like, sometimes they cite that particular piece as like this break where, this is the modern era. There's no home anymore, right? So
very interesting. And one common thread I picked out was, I think across eras, composer got a lot more adventurous and tried to break the structure that was originally framed. So very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Bonus points for that answer as well.
Thank you.
Great
Thank
performance
you.
in
Yes.
this game segment.